Hi there, people. See, I'm not calling you folks this time. Changing it up a bit. Welcome to our final science lesson. And we're looking at several topics today. So if you want to, I've included in the video description the different times when the different points of the lessons end. So you can always come back and watch different parts later. We'll be discussing the following. We'll be looking at earthquakes. We'll be looking at volcanoes. We'll be looking at the formation of mountains, and we'll be looking at fossils and talking about dinosaurs. And that's why I got my Brachiosaurus tie on today. Yeah, there are some pterosaurs or pteranodons there flying in the background, but it's all about the Brachiosaurus. Who are we trying to kid here? Okay, so earthquakes. Earthquakes are a terrifying phenomenon. They kill untold numbers of people every year. As a child, I developed an early fear and respect for earthquakes from the Land Before Time movies. These little baby dinosaurs would cry out, "Earth shake, earth shake." Now, an earth shake sounds delicious, but an earthquake is deadly. So what is an earthquake exactly? Well, an earthquake is an unexpected movement, a sudden movement in the ground caused by the movement of tectonic plates. And as parts of the earth crunch against each other, it causes terrific vibrations. And if you've got structures that are built, they better be built pretty solidly because they'll be destroyed or damaged by those earthquakes. Of course, not all earthquakes are huge. In fact, some you may not even feel. So you will often hear the word seismic. So the word seismic refers to earthquake type activity. So normally I like to write in my Sharpie, but after all of these lessons, my Sharpie is getting a little bit dull. So I'm using this lovely green pen that I took from the school for professional use only. So, seismic event. So we look at where earthquakes start. Now, earthquakes start in an area called the focus. And so if you look underground, if you dig deep underground, you can see two plates. Let's say we see these two plates that are grinding against each other. They're pushing against each other. Underground there, that's what we would consider to be the focus of the earthquake. The epicenter of the earthquake is exactly right above the focus. So it is on the surface, the epicenter of wherever the focus is. And so from the epicenter, we detect different waves that are coming out. And so there are three different kinds of waves in the earthquake. The fastest one, and the first one that we feel, is called a P wave, or a primary wave. That's just the letter P. And so they are pretty much warning waves. They are usually not very damaging, but you know that there's a good chance that things could get worse, because then we get the secondary waves. So the secondary waves are basically the shearing forces. You get the vibrations through the earth that are coming at different directions that are causing a lot more damage. And they take longer. They will come after those P waves. So when you feel the initial vibration, particularly if you live in a fault zone, which is an area where two tectonic plates are bordering, you will want to take shelter. And because then the more damaging waves will come. The most damaging waves are the surface waves. So that's the third type, and they basically roll. Basically, the ground rolls like an ocean, causing enormous destruction. And so if you look at places such as the Ring of Fire, the Ring of Fire refers to the whole area bordering the Pacific Ocean. So along the west coast of North America and South America, along Australia, the Pacific Islands, and East Asia, that is where the Pacific tectonic plate is located. And so because it is moving against a series of other tectonic plates, then you get a lot of earthquake activity, seismic activity, as well as we'll see a lot of volcanic activity, which is related. So in the event of an earthquake, if you can, one of the problems is if the building is not sound and secure, the foundation of that building can collapse. And so it can be a good idea to take shelter under a table. Barring that, you can also go in the door frame. The door frames are a little bit sturdier than just being underneath in the open in a room. But a lot of these places along the Ring of Fire are structured so that their buildings can survive. The foundations are earthquake proof. They really have to consider that in their engineering. Okay. And so the fault, basically there's a slight difference between the fault and the fault zone. A fault is just where any two rock surfaces are meeting against each other. The fault zone refers to that entire area, as mentioned, where two tectonic plates are meeting. So we actually have three different kinds of faults. The first one, which is the least damaging, is the normal fault. And that is where you have two plates that are coming apart from each other. And so in this particular case, there's usually not a lot of damage. It's not really too worrisome. In some of these places that have earthquakes, you'll have just a little bit of rattling. So, make sure that you don't put your trinkets or whatever, your decorations on the very edge of a table. That would not be good. Our second one, though, which is the most damaging, is the reverse fault. So this is converging, where you get two plates and one of them is getting pushed up. One of them is getting pushed up by the other. And so this causes an enormous amount of damage. And because there's really not any room for them to go, right, but up. And whatever's on top of that land is kaput. And then our other kind is called the slip strike or transform plates. Yes, I'm referring to some notes here because there's a lot of information in this whole PowerPoint. So please don't begrudge me. And so the slip strike, you basically get two plates and they are converging, going in different directions. Or they're shearing rather. So they're sliding against each other. And so it's really cool if you check out the PowerPoint, which I hope you have or you will. You can actually see it looks like a line in the earth, like a scar in the ground, because it's been cutting in that line where they've been shearing. Okay, so that concludes our look at earthquakes. We'll be looking next at volcanoes. Volcanoes are very exciting and closely related because, as we'll see, it's this seismic activity which is the trigger cause for these volcanoes. The legendary singer Jimmy Buffett, perhaps best known for his song Margaritaville, he's got another song called Volcano, and it speaks to the dangers of volcanoes, I should say. It goes like this. He says, I don't know where I'm gonna go when the volcano blows. And he makes a compelling point, Mr. Buffett does, because when a volcano explodes, really there's no place that you can go other than the afterlife, because you'll be buried in lava, you'll be buried in ash. And so we are fortunate, though. It's not like being near a volcano is a death sentence, because we do have seismologists, we have geologists who are studying the warning signs of volcanoes. And so your best bet is just to evacuate, because you can't exactly volcano-proof your home. You'll basically be covered in lava, suffocated in ash, and buried alive, if not burned to a crisp. So yeah, you don't want to hang around volcanoes. That's not a good thing. So the question is, what is a volcano exactly? I mean, we've all heard of it. What is the actual definition? This is really cool. The volcano is actually a vent from the crust of the earth into the mantle. And so you've hopefully looked at the model of the earth, the examples of the different layers. The mantle is underneath that thin crust. The mantle is actually the thickest layer in the earth. And the deeper you go down, the hotter it gets, and it becomes more molten. It becomes more liquidy. And so if you went into a volcano and you just kept on going, if you were somehow able to survive that, if you had like a super suit, you could like swim through all that lava and get all the way to the core of the earth eventually, which would be pretty exciting. It would be a really lovely family vacation, assuming that you had some kind of grudge against your family. So a volcano is basically a vent toward the mantle of the earth. And because the mantle of the earth is largely composed of magma, this hot, molten collection of rock, and which when it erupts becomes lava, then that is basically our source of of extreme lava and heat. That's why it's so dangerous, because we're not meant to be down in the mantle of the Earth. Okay, so how do they form? Basically, they form when the enormous seismic pressures eventually cause lava to spew and erupt from the Earth. And sometimes they'll actually build up. You might wonder, okay, why are all volcanoes like these mountains? Why doesn't just lava come up from the ground randomly, like out of the sewer lid? That's why people don't like living next to those manholes. But basically, it's because the lava is coming up, and it might just be bubbling up a little bit first, and over time, over millions of years, and as the lava cools and hardens, the stuff that is leaked up, it forms these mountains. And so that's the shape of it. And so, of course, we'll look at there are a few different forms and shapes that these volcanoes can take, which affect the violence of their explosions. Okay, so a volcano that is erupting is known as active. A volcano that is not erupting is dormant. So it's like it's asleep. And so actually, you know that the French verb dormir is to sleep. So you may know that song, Frère Jacques, dormez-vous. So if you actually named your volcano Frère Jacques, you would hope that it continues to dormir, because you don't want to be buried alive in lava. Okay, sorry to ruin a childhood song there. But yes, so dormant volcanoes, though, that does not mean when you hear a dormant volcano, that doesn't mean, oh, it's okay, that volcano is dormant. No, it just means that at that moment, it's not erupting. It could erupt and become active and blow up for a day or so, and then, go dormant again. But, you won't care then because you've been buried in ash. Okay, so a couple different ways they form. One of them is that when you get these converging plates underneath the ground, you're basically forcing this hot magma to come up as lava and then spew, cool, and form a volcano. Another way is that you get kind of like a bubble. This is called the plume method. The bubble of magma comes up through an opening in the surface from that pressure that the heat is causing, and then forms. This often happens underwater too, where it'll come out and immediately form a volcanic island. And so when it's under the ocean, it actually cools very quickly, as you can imagine, from the water. But from that point, because that's still the point where there's access to the mantle, there's still risk of eruption. That's just how the volcano shape itself forms. So we have three different kinds of volcanoes. The first kind of the most lovely kind, is the stratovolcano. So these are high and steep. So you may have heard about, this is my lovely drawing, you may have heard about Pompeii, which was a Roman city located near Mount Vesuvius. And so Pompeii, this was around 70 some AD, and so they lived a very decadent lifestyle. It was really, they really loved to party. Let's just put it at that, because this is, a grade 7 course. And one day, though, this volcano erupted, and the whole town was buried in lava. And you'll actually see in your PowerPoint for the volcanoes, pictures from Pompeii. Now, when you actually go to Pompeii, I was there when I was 20. Oh, those were the wild young days. But we went to Pompeii, and they have some casts there. Those aren't the original bodies actually that are covered that you would see in Pompeii. A lot of those have been moved to a museum in Naples. But they're still excavating it. They really started doing that a lot in the 1970s. But there's still a lot that they haven't dug up, because it was quite a large city. Very interesting. Some people said that it was the sinful behavior of those who were living in Pompeii that caused it. But as we know, it was seismic forces there that were at work, because it wasn't like the good people were spared. Everyone was gone. So that's a stratovolcano. Mount Vesuvius is an example of that. Mount St. Helens in the United States in the Northwest, which had a huge eruption in the 1980s, is also an example of a stratovolcano. Our second kind of volcano that we have is called a cinder cone volcano. And so it is also steep, but it has got, I got it right here. It is a lot shorter. So an example of that, there's a Mount Stromboli in Italy, which is consistent with that shape. And so not quite as violent of explosions because the height, it doesn't need to be quite so powerful to get out from the volcano. It's not quite as severe. Our third kind, which is a little bit like a combination of both, is the shield volcano. Shield volcano, these are the largest volcanoes. These are sloping. These are kind of a shallower slope to it, but they are large, even larger than our stratovolcanoes. Now, those shield volcanoes are often actually found on the seafloor, and so they can cause all kinds of excitement down there. I've got actually more detail about that. We were discussing that in our grade 8 lesson about the formation of ocean landforms. So you can always check that out if you're really passionate about volcanic activity. And I mean, who wouldn't be, right? Especially if you're living near one. Okay, so there are different ways we monitor volcanoes. Unlike the people of Pompeii who had no idea really of knowing, I think some of them actually had reported detecting some kind of irregular activity or signs from the volcano, but we have very modern ways now to detect the seismic activity. So one of them that we can be aware of, we know that, for example, the stratovolcanoes tend to be a little bit more explosive in the way that the ash and the lava erupts from them. And so we also detect cracks. Like if you see there's a crack in the volcano that wasn't there before, that's definitely a worrisome sign because it means that the pressure and the heat are starting to build and that it may only be a matter of time. Very tragically, in the late 1980s in Colombia, there was a volcano, and seismologists were warning. They said, you've got to evacuate this area because a lot of people are going to die if you don't. And the government said, oh, we're not really worried about that. It'll be okay. Stop making such a fuss. And on the day that it was actually going to erupt, they said, oh, maybe we'll start to evacuate some people. But by then it was too late, and tens of thousands of people died. So mainly the only real action you can do when you get a warning, yeah, there's not much you can do if you're near the volcano, but if you have forewarning, you can get out of there. That's basically the only way to get out of the situation that is a volcanic death. Okay, other ways that we have, we can study the gas geochemistry. So scientists monitor these volcanoes, particularly when they're near populated areas, and they can study then how things are changing. If they're seeing a change in the consistency of the chemicals, that's something to worry about. They can also look at geology. So are the components of the lava and the rocks around the around the volcano changing? Basically, any changes are cause for worry with volcanoes. And then also hydrology. So as you can imagine, when the heat and the pressure are that immense, they have an effect on the groundwater and the water cycle around it. And so changes to that can also be signs that something is not right. As far as the level of volcanic explosions, as much as if you dip your hand into lava, it's never a good idea, there are different levels of volcanic explosions, just as there are different levels of earthquakes. So earthquakes are actually measured with the Richter scale. And so basically every time you go up by 1 on the Richter scale, the earthquake is 30 times more powerful. So if you get or an earthquake that says 3 on the Richter scale, that is 900 times more powerful than one that is magnitude 1. As far as the Richter scale, if you get something that's like a 2 to a 3, a few people might feel that a little bit. So that's not really all that severe. Most people probably won't even feel an earthquake that's between 2 and 3. When you get to 5, on the Richter scale, that starts to actually be damaging. There will be property damage usually. When you get to an 8 on the Richter scale, that's when it's like total destruction. Some of these tragedies that you might see on TV from other parts of the world. And it goes all the way up to 10. If you get up to 10, that's pretty much like wiping out life in that area. Now, as far as volcanic explosions, volcanoes are actually measured on a similar scale. It's called the VEI, though. It's called the Volcanic Explosivity Index. And so basically in a similar way, the more destructive it is. If you looked at some of the largest explosions ever, such as Krakatoa in the 1800s, was, I believe, somewhere between 8 and 9. And so this volcano, actually, just to give you some idea of how powerful it was, there were sailors 100 kilometers away whose eardrums burst just from the sound of this volcano. it emitted such a plume, such a cloud of ash that it actually lowered the average global temperature by, was it a degree or so, for a span of about 10 or 20 years. So absolutely enormous, an effect of this volcano. It really humbles you knowing that, for all our technology, we're really at the mercy of the mighty forces and the magma that lies beneath us. Isn't it amazing to think if you drill just right underneath you right now, you would come eventually to hot molten magma, and you would also probably really tick off your families. They'd say, "Stop digging in the basement there." Okay. Yeah, I guess you could argue it's your science homework, but it's really not. It's really, I'm not assigning you to go into the mantle of the earth. That being said, it is kind of a romantic idea. There's a famous story called Journey to the Center of the Earth, where they were trying to figure out what would happen. Of course, it was a fantasy, really. There were all kinds of creatures and stuff that were living under there. Okay, and so the name for the stuff that these volcanoes are actually spewing out, they're called pyroclastic flows. So pyro, that root word from the Latin, refers to fire, and so for pyros. And so that refers to several things. It includes the lava. So basically lava being incredibly hot. We looked at the temperature of lava earlier in our heat unit, our thermal energy unit. Extremely hot. It'll basically melt you or anything that it touches. It'll also cause fires in the surrounding area. And eventually when it cools, it'll bury and entomb you, just like it did with these people in Pompeii. There's also ash. This is a huge concern too, because even if you're not directly hit by the lava, the giant clouds of ash, they can build up and suffocate you, or they can collapse buildings on top of you. They can cause you to suffocate from lack of oxygen. We also have mud flows. So basically, when the lava mixes with water and mud, then this can cause avalanches and landslides just like other mountains can. So extremely deadly, these volcanoes, but I guess it's the price that we pay for being on the only planet in our solar system that can sustain human life. Okay, and these mudslides, they are called lahars. And so that's actually in your PowerPoint as well. Definitely check out those pictures because they're almost as vivid as my beautiful drawings. Okay. So that concludes our look at volcanoes. We'll be moving on looking at mountains. The mountains section is quite short. Looking at basically mountains are large risings in the ground, so large outcrops. And they're formed, once again, we see by seismic forces, by the Earth's plates moving together. And so typically you get converging forces and enormous pressure, and it can form one of two mountains. And so we have fold mountains. Fold mountains, basically you have the Earth, and it's getting pushed like this into a mountain. And so the ground, yeah, you're kind of surprised. The ground is kind of flexible. Well, when the ground gets heated up as well in these seismic events, that allows the Earth to be a little bit more malleable, to bend a little bit more. So when you have these folded layers of Earth, because as you know, the different layers of Earth, you get like bedrock, and different layers are harder or softer than others. The folded parts at the top are called the syncline, and the anticline. The parts at the bottom are called the syncline. Yes. Now the thing is, even though some parts of the Earth are flexible enough to be bent like that into fold mountains, you will also get some parts that are very brittle. So the rock might break away. Instead of bending, it'll just break. And so, especially if you've got a very hard, firm rock that is, it's very stiff, that's what I mean. So that's actually called a fault mountain, because it's like when we remember these faults, it breaks along a crack. And so if you have, let's say you have a mountain like this, and it cracks along here, you will get a jagged edge. You get a jagged edge to your mountain. And so you'll see images of that as well on D2L. Okay. Now, you may wonder, how can you tell if a mountain is young or if a mountain is old? And so the way you can do that is you can tell, because in the case of, especially say a fault mountain, because it's very jagged, it will be new, because that force happened very recently to cause it to be like that. Eventually, though, when we look at the forces of erosion and weathering from our Pokemon lesson, gradually the wind will wear away the parts that are sticking up, and eventually it'll become more rounded, like a hill. So if you looked at the Himalayan mountains or the Rocky Mountains, these are relatively new mountain ranges because they are tall and jagged. If you looked at eastern Canada, at the Laurentians, or the eastern United States with the Appalachians, their mountains are much lower. They aren't these sharp, high peaks. They tend to be more like large hills. And so those are examples of older mountains as well. The Alps in Europe as well, they are certainly newer than those ones in eastern North America, but they are still more rounded and reduced in size than the Rockies or the Himalayas. So that's basically that principle of erosion and weathering comes back and affects everything, even the mightiest of mountains. Okay, so now we get to our final part of our lesson and our course, the fossils section. We're going to talk about when dinosaurs roamed the earth. So basically fossils are traces of living remains, of something that used to be alive. It may actually contain part of that organism, or it may just be a trace of it that lets us know that that organism had some kind of impact. So it actually comes from the word fossilis, meaning to dig up. So the Latin word to dig up. And so literally that's what it means, because we dig these fossils up. And so actually this the study of paleontology, like especially looking at dinosaurs and things like that, really took off in the 1800s, particularly as society was industrializing and looking for sources of coal and oil. They also happened, as they were digging, to come upon various dinosaur bones and other creatures' fossils. So there are a couple different ways that we can study and determine how old these fossils are. Because what if it's just some prankster, like the kids who live behind me, who are just putting some bones in the backyard, some chicken bones, and hey, lo and behold, I'm doing some gardening, and I think I found a dinosaur, right? So how can we tell how this is done? Well, one method is called relative dating. And I can tell you when I was in 7th grade and I read about relative dating, I was shocked. I thought, that's wrong to date your relatives, but that's not what it's about. Relative dating means finding the relative dates of fossils compared to each other. So for example, if you already knew that something that was buried under the earth was 10,000 years old, and then you found something else that was about twice as deep, you could perhaps make a rough estimate that that was 20,000 years old, that thing that was deeper. And that's the thing though about relative dating, that you don't know for sure. These are estimates. And so what we have different layers in the earth called strata. And so strata just means layers. And let me just write a little bit darker here. Oh, now I've made it too messy. Oh no. Now I've gone and done it. Okay, so strata. So you see these layers. And of course there'll be different minerals. One of the really cool things, you'll see images of this in the PowerPoint, are when, particularly when there's a fault, like when a mountain breaks off, and you can see inside the different layers of rock within. Really fascinating. So you have to study the different objects and how far deep they were in the strata in order to figure out how old it was with relative dating. There's what's called the principle of superposition, which means that whatever's on top is newer. Because gradually, as mentioned, with deposition, the soil, the layers build up. And so the deeper you dig, the older the items you're going to find. You're likely not going to find a dinosaur bone, a dinosaur fossil over top of last week's pizza box, right? Because the question is, unless you remove those dinosaur bones and put them on top, how could it get there, right? Okay, our second method, which is more precise, is radiometric dating. So radiometric dating is when you actually look at the elements. So of course this requires some pretty powerful uses of technology in order to do this, but you need to look at the different cells. And because certain elements are quite unstable, and over time they will turn to other elements. For example, uranium, which is famous for its use in nuclear technology, over time it's quite unstable and it will turn into lead. And so scientists will study, and you can see diagrams of this, but I'll make a little one for you right here. So let's say these are all particles, these are all atoms of uranium, U. But over time, we measure it in half-lives. Different elements have different half-lives, meaning the time that it takes for the original or the parent material to transform into a daughter material, something different. So uranium will transform into lead, and so the point at which it's reached one half-life is when half of the original material will become lead. So take a look here. I'm going to put circles around here so we can tell. Okay. So from this uranium, we had 4 uranium atoms, and now half of them are lead. So that is one half-life. 2 half-lives would mean that half of that remaining amount of uranium became lead as well. So in that case, we would then have 3 lead atoms and 1 uranium. So there is a question or two actually on your quiz about these half-lives. So you want to make sure you are okay with that. Okay, so put this video on loop if you have to. Okay. So radiometric dating, that's how it's done. That's more precise. You can actually then tell, based on understanding that different elements have different half-lives, the actual number of years. Whereas relative dating is really more of a guess. And really, for relative dating, you have to know how old something was in the first place, which in some cases may require radio dating. In some cases, if you found a human artifact and you knew, yeah, this is from the Greek Empire of 500 BC, then, okay, you could start to maybe place some other things there. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about geologic time. So some of these different eras and how we have changed and how life has changed on our planet. It's one of my favorite things because I love dinosaurs. Ever since I was a young child, especially the Apatosaurus. The Apatosaurus now, or the Brontosaurus, they're actually, it was 5 years ago, discovered that they were different. People thought, oh, Brontosaurus is just the Apatosaurus. No, Brontosaurus actually has, it's not quite as tall or wide, and it also has a slightly different shaped collarbone. So through intense study of fossils, we were able to find that out and classify them differently. So the Brachiosaurus looks kind of similar, but it's even taller than those creatures. So yeah, it is a passion of mine. I think a passion for most young kids, because it's fascinating, right? They're like imaginary creatures but that really lived. And in fact, in the early days, people thought that they didn't believe when the first fossils were found that this was real. People thought it was a hoax. They said, no, this is make-believe. You've just told us to stop believing in dragons, and now you're telling us that they were really there? So the geologic time is divided into different segments. So the largest segment is called the eon. So the eon, enormous amounts of time. And so our very first eon in the creation of our planet, for the first 4 billion years, was called the Precambrian eon. And we have very little fossil evidence from this time. Life as we know it was just developing, and so what little evidence we have, they're very simple organisms. So things like worms or bacteria that we can find there. Once we get to the Cambrian period of our next era, we find actual evidence of amazingly diverse organisms, because in this time, actually, it was kind of like an evolutionary experiment. So there were all kinds of different creatures that were evolving differently. Some of them had like 5 eyes and 1 tail and were like flapping around, and a lot of them didn't survive. But for a period of about 15 million years, there were all kinds of different organisms that didn't make it. Those that did eventually, in a sense, they were like our grandparents. And one of the fascinating places that you can actually visit where a huge amount of Cambrian era fossils were discovered starting in 1909 is the Burgess Shale. So if you're actually driving to BC, in Field, BC, it's shortly after you cross the Alberta-BC border, there are a few little tourist sites. I've never actually been to the Burgess Shale Center, but you can actually take guided tours from there and visit these places, see a number of the different fossils. So this period was about 500 million years ago. So really fascinating. You can see some of these weird little organisms that don't resemble anything that you would see today. It's kind of like visiting another planet, I can imagine. I'm usually in a hurry to get to where I'm going, right? Field is usually not the end destination. Okay, but enough about me, and more about some other eras. So the dinosaurs. In what era did the dinosaurs live? They lived in the Mesozoic era. So this actually spanned from 245 million years to 65 million years ago. So a total of about 180 million years when the dinosaurs ruled the earth. So if we were wiped out today as humans, we would meet the dinosaurs, like up in heaven or hell or whatever, and we'd say, hey, humans, we were around for, a million years. And the dinosaurs would laugh in our face. They'd say, oh yeah, you know, we got 180 million under our belt. Come talk to me. Come talk to me next time. Better luck next time there, buckaroos. So really, isn't it amazing to think that humans have been just a tiny, tiny fraction of the time the dinosaurs were on the earth? Now, different periods. After we have eons, we have these eras. And within each era, there were several periods. So you may have heard of the Jurassic period from like Jurassic Park, the Triassic period, the Cretaceous period, when different dinosaurs lived, because it wasn't like most dinosaurs didn't make it all throughout that entire Mesozoic era. And so we have the Cenozoic era at 65 million years ago, which is considered to be the age of mammals. And so there were some mammals that were in the Mesozoic area with the dinosaurs. It's believed, now there are many different theories, some more credible than others, that as far as why did the dinosaurs die off, it's believed that some felt that a meteor hit the Earth, causing enormous clouds to block off and reduce the world's temperature. So for the cold-blooded dinosaurs, this meant that they couldn't regulate their bodies and they died. That volcanoes, perhaps there were some massive volcanic eruptions that did the same thing. In fact, it's very well likely that a combination of these things took place to lead to the extinction of the dinosaurs. There are still dinosaurs today that are alive, and they are birds. Birds evolved from what we call the raptors. So things like velociraptors, they are actually small little creatures. You can see fossils of them in the Royal Tyrrell Museum. They actually had feathers on them. And gradually they evolved, and their descendants that evolved to have more feathers became birds. And so birds literally are dinosaurs, the only existing dinosaurs. Crocodiles, while they were actually alive back in these days of the dinosaurs, they are not considered to be dinosaurs, even if they look like it. When you follow the family tree, they are not. They evolved separately. They did not actually evolve from any particular dinosaur. Kind of like the mastodon and the woolly mammoth, two extinct mammals from our Cenozoic era. They actually are not closely related, even though they both looked like furry elephants. They were quite different. So similarly with crocodiles and dinosaurs, no real close connection there, except of course they would both eat you if they were carnivorous. Okay, so now we have those, so that looks at geologic time, but we also have different kinds of fossils that we see. They're not all the same. So there are 5 different kinds. One of them is that we actually get fossilized bones. And so you'll usually get the organic matter, like the meat and the organs, will decompose into the soil, but the bones are a little bit tougher. And so they will actually, over time, they've got half-life to them too, the elements within the bones. And so the calcium carbonate will actually transform into silica or quartz. That's typical of what happens when we find these actual dinosaur bones. We also get carbonaceous film. And so sometimes you might get a dinosaur that dies and it's all flumped over on the ground. And basically like its skin, which is made partly of carbon, will then leave a bit of a trace. It'll leave like an imprint of what that dinosaur looked like. We also have trace fossils. So trace fossils are things that were not actually part of the dinosaur's body, but they're signs that, the fossils don't have to all be dinosaurs, but who are we kidding? The dinosaurs are what we care about. So they could be like a dinosaur footprint. It could be like the burrow or a cave where the dinosaur dug, but it's not a direct part of the dinosaur. It's just a sign that, yes, there was a dinosaur here. And so we also have the original remains. So in some cases, this is probably the coolest part because you actually see the flesh, in addition to the bone, is actually preserved. And so there have actually been ancient early humans and woolly mammoths perfectly preserved in ice. But it's not just the ice. There are other ways that they can be preserved. So peat bogs, with their high quantity of salt, actually, if you've drowned in a bog, you can be preserved, and people can find you thousands of years later. There's a very famous bog man from about 1000 BC who lived in Denmark. I saw him in a museum when I was 18. Once again, oh, those young wild days. And he was actually murdered. His fellows, prehistoric people, well, I guess that wasn't really a prehistoric age, but his fellow early humans, basically, I think they strangled him or something like that. And then they said, oh, gee, we're going to get in trouble for this. So they threw him in the bog. And so they actually brought his body up, and it kind of shriveled. It was basically the consistency of leather because all that moisture from the salt was all sucked out. And so he was a little shriveled man, basically like, you know what, maybe the length of my tie, which actually kind of creeps me out to wear ties now. But yeah, you can actually see the details of his face. On the PowerPoint, you can see, I think it's a baby woolly mammoth that is covered in ice. And, it's always sad when little elephants die, but, that shows that you've still got a soul if you can feel sad about that. In addition to that, tar pits as well. Tar pits are also a way that you can be preserved, particularly with moisture. If you can prevent decomposition by reducing moisture, then you are set. You are set, my friend, to preserve yourself for the future generations to be creeped out by. Okay, and so in addition, this is particularly cool, we have amber. So we have amber, which basically is like fossilized, petrified tree resin. So like the sap from trees, extremely valuable. And so there have actually been creatures, particularly insects, that get stuck in this the sap from this tree, and basically they die there, right? They suffocate or starve or whatever. And then over time, we found, like in these swamps where we can find the amber, that these creatures, these little bugs, are preserved. And it's fascinating because you can see these bugs that are thousands of years old that you don't really get organisms that are larger than a little insect, but thousands of years old that are preserved in amber. And extremely valuable. In fact, in the Second World War, there was this amber room in the palace of Catherine the Great in Russia, around St. Petersburg, and the Nazis, Hitler basically wanted to steal as much of this amber as he could, but eventually, though, the tides of war pushed against him before he was able to steal all this amber. You're able to go inside the room and visit and see the amber, but you're not allowed to take photographs because they're concerned that the flash from the cameras will affect the quality of the amber. Just extremely valuable and precious amber is as a resource because, yeah, technically it's renewable, but it takes thousands of years really to solidify like that from the original tree resin. Okay, and so our last kind that we have is the mold and cast fossil. So basically what will happen here is that when the animal dies and both its body with flesh and bones decompose, it forms a bit of an indentation in the ground. And gradually, as sediment builds up, so rocks and other things, the rocks that were not actually part of the animal fill in that mold and create a cast. So it'll basically look like a dinosaur bone, but it's actually just made of rock. And so that's what the mold and cast type of fossil is. Okay, so plenty of different fossils. It's a pretty meaty lesson. And but from this point, now once this lesson is available, you will be able to write the quiz. Keep in mind, if it seems like a lot of information, it is an open no quiz. You will have access to basically all or very similar questions on the Review Kahoot. So please check that out first. And I have every confidence that you'll do extremely well on the quiz. Because the material doesn't differ all that much. So I hope you've enjoyed this journey back in time with me, and hopefully you can enjoy the journey back in time, reminiscing about the year we've had together. And I really enjoyed particularly you guys 7E. You're the only class that I've been teaching the science course to, and you made it really enjoyable with the creativity that you brought to every day and the joy that you brought. I remember particularly, if I have to pick one memory, that's been fossilized in my mind, I would have to go with our homemade thermoses. When you were designing the insulation boxes to prevent the ice from melting, that was really cool. I really had no idea how effective that would be. Some of you guys really went to town bringing some hardcore high-tech resources, and of course it showed that the ice didn't melt. Others used just some cardboard or things we had on hand, but that was very impressive still to see that, yeah, it was effective in keeping that ice from melting. But it just showed your ingenuity, your creativity. But what mattered even more to me was the kindness. And I remember how you guys would help to clean up the classroom, and how it was our ritual that we'd always say it was time to shine. And of course, I hope even if whether or not we have each other in a class next year, that you continue shining in whatever you do, both personally, academically, and professionally. And I wish you all the best. And remember that, the time we have is limited, just like the dinosaurs. But we can, just like the dinosaurs, do great things in the time we have together and the time that we have on this very, very old planet of ours. So have yourselves a wonderful summer, and I will see you on the other side.